Why sex was once prescribed as medicine. The doctor's hands are moving between your legs, and you're trying not to think about how wrong this feels. It's 1885. You're lying on a leather examination table in a respectable London medical office, and Dr. Pemberton is explaining that what he's doing is purely scientific. Therapeutic massage of the pelvic region, he calls it. His voice clinical and detached as his fingers work with practiced efficiency. The manual manipulation will induce hysterical paroxysm and restore your feminine constitution to proper balance. You don't know what hysterical paroxysm means, but your body is starting to respond to his touch in ways that make you feel deeply uncomfortable and strangely excited at the same time. The respectable women's magazines never mentioned anything like this. Your mother certainly never prepared you for lying half naked while a distinguished physician manipulates your most intimate areas while discussing the wandering nature of your womb. Dr. Pemberton continues his work, occasionally pausing to make notes on a clipboard or adjust the gas lamps for better lighting. This isn't sexual, he's assured you multiple times. This is medicine. Scientific, proven, prescribed by the finest medical schools in Europe. Your hysteria, he explained, is caused by your uterus displacing itself within your body, creating pressure on other organs and disrupting your natural feminine balance. The only cure is to manually stimulate the affected area until your body experiences the therapeutic crisis that will return everything to its proper position. And then it happens. Your back arches, your breathing becomes rapid and shallow, and waves of sensation crash through your body in a way that feels both overwhelming and deeply satisfying. Dr. Pemberton nods approvingly and makes another note. Excellent response, he murmurs. The paroxysm was quite robust. Your uterus should now be properly repositioned. I recommend weekly treatments until your symptoms fully resolve. You lie there afterward, trying to process what just happened. It felt nothing like the medical procedures you've experienced before. It felt like something else entirely, something you don't have words for, something that seems to exist in the shadowy space between medicine and sin. But Dr. Pemberton is already washing his hands and scheduling your next appointment, treating what just occurred as routine medical care. This isn't fiction. This is history. For thousands of years, across multiple civilizations, sexual stimulation wasn't just about pleasure or reproduction. It was medicine. Doctors prescribed orgasms like they prescribed bloodletting. Medical textbooks contained detailed instructions for therapeutic genital massage. Respectable physicians built their careers on providing what they called sexual treatment to cure everything from depression to digestive problems. The woman lying on that Victorian examination table is experiencing the culmination of a medical tradition that stretches back over 3 millennia. From ancient Egyptian papyri to medieval monastery libraries, from Renaissance anatomical studies to Victorian medical journals, the idea that sexual health was integral to overall wellness, and that trained healers had both the knowledge and authority to intervene in the most intimate aspects of human experience, shaped how civilizations understood bodies, pleasure, and the proper relationship between patients and physicians. But this story isn't just about medical curiosity or historical oddity. It's about power disguised as healing, social control masquerading as healthcare, and the remarkable human capacity to medicalize the most private aspects of existence. It's about how scientific language has been used to justify authority over sexuality, how gender roles have been enforced through medical diagnosis, and how the most intimate human experiences became subjects for public professional intervention. The prescriptions were real. The treatments were administered in clean, well-lit medical offices by physicians who had trained at the finest medical schools. The patients paid substantial fees and returned regularly for follow-up care. medical journals published peer-reviewed articles documenting successful outcomes and refinements in technique. This wasn't back-alley quackery or folk medicine practiced by village healers. This was mainstream, respectable, scientifically justified medical practice. The story begins not in prudish Victorian England, but in the blazing heat of ancient Egypt, where the first doctors learned to read human bodies like hieroglyphs and developed theories about wandering wombs that would influence medical thinking for over 3,000 years. The Egyptian physician carefully unrolls his papyrus scroll, its surface covered with hieroglyphic text that will somehow survive longer than the civilization that created it. The year is approximately 1800 BCE, and the woman sitting before him describes symptoms that have become disturbingly familiar. Mysterious pains that move around her body, sudden fainting spells, and an inexplicable sense of unease that seems to have no physical cause. According to the Cahun Papyrus, one of the earliest medical documents ever discovered, her condition is clear. Her womb has become displaced, wandering through her body cavity and pressing against other organs. This isn't metaphorical but literal medical theory. The Egyptians believed the uterus could actually migrate within a woman's body, causing problems wherever it settled. A displaced uterus near the lungs might cause breathing difficulties. One that had wandered toward the heart could produce palpitations and emotional disturbances. The treatment is equally specific. The physician prepares aromatic substances, honey, myrrh, frankincense, designed to attract the wayward organ back to its proper position. But sometimes more direct intervention is required. His hands move to the woman's genital area, applying oils and manual pressure in ways designed to anchor the uterus and restore her health. The intense physical response that follows isn't understood as sexual pleasure, but as medical evidence that the treatment is working. This isn't primitive superstition, but sophisticated medical theory, practiced by highly trained professionals. Egyptian physicians studied for years at temple schools, learning anatomy, pharmacology, and surgical techniques. They understood the importance of cleanliness, kept detailed medical records, and approached treatment with systematic precision. When they prescribed sexual treatment, they did so with the same scientific authority they brought to any other medical intervention. The Egyptian approach also established fundamental patterns that would persist throughout the history of sexual medicine. The idea that sexual problems indicated broader health issues, that sexual satisfaction was necessary for overall wellness, and that medical authorities had both the right and responsibility to intervene in intimate matters. These concepts, born in ancient Egypt, would travel across cultures and through centuries, evolving but never entirely disappearing. Greek philosophers and physicians inherited Egyptian medical knowledge but added their own theoretical sophistication. Hippocrates, writing in the 5th century BCE, expanded the wandering womb concept into a comprehensive medical philosophy that would influence thinking about female sexuality for the next 2 millennia. The uterus, Hippocrates explained to his students, is connected to the entire female constitution through channels that carry vital essences throughout the body. When a woman goes too long without sexual intercourse, these channels become blocked, causing the womb to dry out and seek moisture elsewhere. The word they used, hysteria, from the Greek hystera meaning uterus, would become one of the most influential diagnostic categories in medical history. But Greek sexual medicine was more sophisticated than simple wandering womb theory. Physicians distinguished between different types of sexual activity and their therapeutic effects. Marriage provided not just physical satisfaction but social stability. For unmarried women, widows, and others who couldn't access regular sexual activity, physicians developed techniques for therapeutic intervention that maintained medical propriety while providing necessary treatment. The philosophical framework mattered because it transformed intimate touch into clinical procedure. When Greek physicians provided therapeutic genital stimulation, they weren't engaging in sexual activity but administering medical treatment. The goal wasn't pleasure but health. The response they sought to produce wasn't orgasm but hysterical paroxysm, a therapeutic crisis that would restore proper bodily function. Plato gave the theory cosmic significance, describing the uterus as an animal living within women that becomes sad and unfortunate when it doesn't join with the male to produce children. This wasn't crude anthropomorphism, but sophisticated philosophy that understood sexual organs as having their own nature and needs that must be satisfied for health and harmony. The Greeks also developed systematic pharmacology for sexual medicine, cataloging substances that affected sexual desire and function. Satyrion, a type of wild orchid, was prized for producing powerful erections. Lettuce was avoided by men seeking to maintain sexual vigor because of its supposed cooling properties. This pharmaceutical approach reflected the Greek emphasis on understanding underlying principles, rather than just treating symptoms. Roman medicine took Greek theories and systematized them with characteristic practical efficiency. Where Greeks had been philosophical, Romans were empirical. They developed standardized training programs, created detailed protocols, and established formal institutions for sexual medicine that transformed it from individual healing art into professional medical specialty. Roman physicians documented which treatments were most effective, refined techniques based on clinical experience, and shared innovations with colleagues across the empire. They established sexual medicine as legitimate healthcare deserving institutional support and professional respect. Roman bathhouses became centers for therapeutic massage that naturally extended into sexual treatment, providing socially acceptable contexts for intimate medical intervention. The Roman military incorporated sexual medicine into its medical services, recognizing that women's health affected the morale and effectiveness of fighting units. This military application ensured that standardized techniques spread throughout the empire as legions were stationed in different provinces. By the height of the Roman Empire, sexual medicine had become a prestigious medical specialty practiced by the finest physicians and available to wealthy clients across the known world. The medieval period presented unique challenges for sexual medicine. Christian theology taught that sexual desire was a consequence of the fall, requiring control rather than medical encouragement. Yet the same church that preached sexual restraint also promoted healing as divine calling and preserved classical medical knowledge as part of God's gift of reason to humanity. Medieval physicians resolved this contradiction by maintaining medical knowledge while wrapping it in religious justification. The wandering womb theory persisted, but was often explained as divine punishment for sin. Sexual treatment could be justified as part of God's mercy for human suffering, and physicians had sacred duty to restore proper bodily function, even when that required intimate intervention. Medieval monasteries became unexpected centers for preserving and developing sexual medicine knowledge. Monks who served as healers maintained extensive libraries of classical medical texts and accumulated detailed knowledge about treatments for sexual disorders. While secular physicians often lacked access to comprehensive medical education, monasteries preserved sophisticated understanding of sexual medicine that might otherwise have been lost. Islamic medicine developed along different lines, facing no theological prohibition against studying sexuality. Physicians like Al-Razi and Ibn Sina wrote extensively about sexual health, developing new treatments and refining old ones based on clinical observation rather than religious constraint. When Islamic medical texts were translated into Latin during the 12th century, they reintroduced comprehensive sexual medicine to Christian Europe through works like Constantine the African's detailed treatises on sexual treatment. The Renaissance brought renewed interest in classical learning and systematic anatomical investigation. Andreas Vesalius provided the first accurate descriptions of female reproductive anatomy, revealing that many classical beliefs about wandering wombs were anatomically impossible. However, rather than abandoning sexual medicine, Renaissance physicians developed new explanations that preserved essential treatments while accommodating improved anatomical knowledge. The printing press revolutionized dissemination of sexual medicine knowledge. Detailed treatment manuals could be widely distributed among physicians, leading to more standardized approaches and consistent procedures. Medical schools developed formal curricula, including systematic instruction in sexual medicine. The professionalization of medicine that began in the Renaissance established sexual medicine as legitimate specialty, deserving serious study and institutional support. The scientific revolution of the 17th century brought mechanical philosophy to sexual medicine. The body was understood to operate according to hydraulic and mechanical principles that could be manipulated through scientific methods. This mechanistic approach provided new justification for hands-on medical treatment, while maintaining the clinical objectivity that distinguished therapeutic intervention from ordinary sexual activity. By the 18th century, Enlightenment emphasis on reason and systematic inquiry led to more careful study of sexual treatments. Physicians began conducting empirical studies, documenting which approaches were most effective and refining techniques based on clinical evidence rather than theoretical speculation. The stage was set for the dramatic developments of the 19th century, when sexual medicine would reach unprecedented heights of professional acceptance and social respectability. The gaslight flickers in Dr. Wellington's Harley Street examination room as he prepares his newest medical instrument, a gleaming mechanical device with brass fittings and electrical connections representing the latest advancement in therapeutic technology. The year is 1875, and sexual medicine is experiencing its most dramatic expansion in recorded history. Mrs. Charlotte Pemberton adjusts her elaborate bustle as she settles onto the examination table, her tightly laced corset making breathing difficult. She's described symptoms that have become increasingly common among middle-class Victorian women: chronic fatigue, emotional instability, insomnia, and vague pains that migrate around her body without apparent cause. Dr. Wellington nods knowingly as she speaks. He's diagnosed dozens of similar cases this month alone. Hysteria, he pronounces with the authority of the modern medical science. A displacement of nervous energy caused by irregularities in the feminine reproductive system. Fortunately, we now have highly effective treatments available. He gestures toward the mechanical device in the corner, its electric motor humming quietly. The pneumatic stimulator can provide therapeutic intervention more efficiently and consistently than traditional manual methods. The Industrial Revolution has transformed sexual medicine as thoroughly as it has transformed everything else. New manufacturing techniques make medical instruments widely available and affordable. Improved transportation spreads medical knowledge rapidly between cities and countries. Urban concentration brings larger numbers of patients to physicians who can specialize in particular treatments. The demand for hysteria treatment has expanded dramatically. Pierre Briquet's systematic study documents over 400 detailed case histories and suggests that 25% of all women suffer from some form of hysterical disorder. While modern observers might question these diagnostic criteria, they reflected real problems in women's lives. The physical constraints of restrictive clothing, the psychological stress of limited opportunities, and the social isolation that characterized middle-class female existence. Victorian physicians respond by systematizing and expanding sexual treatment. Medical schools develop formal curricula for training specialists in gynecological medicine. Hospitals establish departments dedicated to treating female disorders. Professional societies publish journals devoted to advancing knowledge about sexual medicine and sharing treatment innovations. Jean-Martin Charcot brings unprecedented scientific rigor to hysteria study at his clinic in the Salpêtrière Hospital. His public demonstrations draw international audiences of physicians eager to learn the latest techniques. Charcot's work represents the peak of scientific respectability for sexual medicine, lending academic credibility to treatments that had previously depended more on tradition than systematic study. The mechanical vibrator, invented in the 1880s, represents both the technological pinnacle and the beginning of the end for medical sexual treatment. Early vibrators are large, expensive devices powered by steam or electricity and operated by trained physicians. They allow doctors to provide therapeutic stimulation more efficiently than manual techniques permit, but their mechanical nature also begins to change how sexual medicine is understood and practiced. Medical journals praise the vibrator as a major advance in therapeutic technique. Physicians no longer need to spend long sessions manually stimulating patients, and the mechanical device provides more precise and controllable treatment. However, the impersonal nature of vibrator treatment removes much of the personal interaction that had characterized traditional sexual medicine, making it more obviously focused on producing specific physical responses rather than providing holistic care. The late 19th century also sees the emergence of alternative explanations for hysteria. The developing field of psychiatry suggests that many symptoms might be psychological rather than physical in origin. Neurological research indicates that the nervous system is more complex than previously understood. These alternative explanations don't immediately displace sexual medicine, but they create doubt about its theoretical foundations. Social context is also becoming problematic. The women's rights movement begins questioning medical authority over women's bodies and lives. Some feminists argue that hysteria diagnosis is used to control women who challenge social norms. Others suggest that hysterical symptoms might be rational responses to oppressive social conditions rather than medical disorders requiring treatment. Religious and moral authorities express growing concern about sexual medicine. While therapeutic stimulation had been accepted as proper medical treatment, the increasingly mechanical and widespread nature of such intervention raises questions about its appropriateness. Some religious leaders argue that intimate medical procedures are morally questionable regardless of therapeutic justification. By the end of the 19th century, sexual medicine faces challenges from multiple directions. Scientific advances questioning its theoretical basis, social movements challenging its authority, and moral concerns about its practice. The convergence of these factors sets the stage for dramatic transformation in the early 20th century. The early 20th century witnesses the rapid decline and virtual disappearance of sexual medicine as mainstream medical practice. The transformation doesn't happen overnight, but rather unfolds through a series of interconnected developments that systematically undermine every foundation upon which sexual medicine had been built. Sigmund Freud's development of psychoanalysis provides the most direct and devastating challenge to traditional sexual medicine. Freud had studied with Charcot in Paris and was intimately familiar with conventional approaches to treating hysteria. He had witnessed the famous demonstrations at the Salpêtrière, observed the mechanical vibrators in action, and initially accepted the physical explanations for hysterical symptoms. But his clinical experience with patients led him to a radically different conclusion. In his consulting room in Vienna, Freud begins experimenting with a revolutionary technique, simply talking to his patients. Instead of applying mechanical stimulation or manual massage, he encourages women to speak freely about their symptoms, their dreams, their memories, and their fears. What he discovers challenges everything the medical establishment believes about hysteria and sexual treatment. The women lying on his couch don't need genital stimulation to experience relief from their symptoms. They need to talk about traumatic experiences, repressed memories, and unconscious conflicts. Their physical symptoms, Freud realizes, are manifestations of psychological distress rather than displaced uteri or disrupted nervous energy. The talking cure, as one of his patients calls it, proves just as effective as mechanical vibrators, but without any physical intervention whatsoever. Freud's approach is revolutionary because it offers not just an alternative treatment, but a completely different explanation for conditions that had been treated through sexual medicine for thousands of years. If hysteria results from repressed memories and unconscious conflicts, then physical stimulation is not only unnecessary, but potentially counterproductive, masking psychological problems rather than addressing their root causes. The implications are staggering. If talking therapy can cure hysteria, then 3 millennia of sexual medicine has been based on fundamentally flawed assumptions. The wandering womb theory, the concept of nervous energy displacement, the entire theoretical framework that justified intimate medical intervention, all of it crumbles under the weight of psychological explanation. But Freud's challenge to sexual medicine goes even deeper. His exploration of human sexuality reveals it to be far more complex and psychologically determined than medical authorities had assumed. Sexual desire, sexual satisfaction, and sexual dysfunction all involve intricate psychological processes that can't be addressed through mechanical stimulation alone. The mind, not the body, is the primary sexual organ. The Freudian revolution coincides with broader changes in medical understanding that further undermine sexual medicine. Advances in neurology reveal that the nervous system is infinitely more complex than 19th century physicians had understood. The discovery of hormones shows that sexual response involves chemical processes that operate on cellular levels far beyond the reach of mechanical intervention. New understanding of anatomy demonstrates conclusively that many beliefs about female reproductive physiology are simply wrong. The development of modern psychiatric diagnosis also contributes to sexual medicine's decline. The American Psychiatric Association begins developing systematic diagnostic criteria that replace vague categories like hysteria with specific, well-defined disorders. Conditions that had been lumped together under the hysteria diagnosis are separated into distinct conditions: depression, anxiety disorders, conversion disorders, somatization disorders, each with its own causes and treatments. This diagnostic revolution makes it impossible to maintain the broad, catch-all approach that had characterized sexual medicine. If a woman's symptoms can be attributed to specific psychiatric conditions with known psychological causes, there's no justification for sexual treatment. The medical foundation for intimate intervention simply evaporates. World War I accelerates these changes by forcing physicians to confront large numbers of male patients with symptoms virtually identical to those traditionally diagnosed as hysteria in women. Soldiers returning from the trenches exhibit the same mysterious physical symptoms: emotional volatility and nervous disturbances that had sent thousands of women to gynecologists for sexual treatment. But these are men, often decorated veterans who had demonstrated courage under fire. The medical establishment can't dismiss their symptoms as feminine weakness or attribute them to wandering wombs. Military physicians are forced to acknowledge that psychological trauma can produce severe physical symptoms in anyone, regardless of gender or sexual status. Shell shock, soldier's heart, and other war neuroses demonstrate conclusively that the mind can affect the body in ways that have nothing to do with sexual organs or reproductive function. The war experience also reveals the inadequacy of physical treatments for psychological problems. Soldiers suffering from shell shock don't respond to mechanical stimulation or pharmaceutical intervention. They need psychological treatment, time to process traumatic experiences, and social support to reintegrate into civilian life. The war creates an entire generation of mental health practitioners who understand that psychological problems require psychological solutions. Meanwhile, the social context of medicine is changing rapidly in ways that make sexual medicine increasingly problematic. The women's suffrage movement has succeeded in many countries, and women are gaining unprecedented political and social autonomy. The paternalistic medical model that had justified physician control over women's sexual health becomes socially and politically unacceptable. Feminist activists begin explicitly challenging medical authority over women's bodies. They argue that the diagnosis of hysteria has been used to control and suppress women who challenge social norms, and that sexual treatment represents a form of sanctioned assault rather than legitimate medical care. Women's magazines begin publishing articles questioning whether mysterious female ailments might be rational responses to oppressive social conditions rather than medical disorders requiring treatment. The changing role of women in society also undermines the social foundations of sexual medicine. As women gain access to education, careers, and economic independence, many of the conditions that had supposedly caused hysteria begin to disappear. Women with meaningful work, intellectual stimulation, and social engagement report fewer of the mysterious symptoms that had filled gynecologists' waiting rooms. The correlation suggests that hysteria might have been a social problem masquerading as a medical condition. Medical education and professional standards evolve in ways that make sexual medicine increasingly difficult to justify or maintain. The establishment of formal medical schools with standardized curricula, rigorous examination requirements, and professional oversight creates new expectations for scientific evidence and clinical effectiveness. The Flexner Report of 1910 revolutionizes medical education by demanding that treatments be based on scientific research rather than tradition or authority. Sexual medicine, with its roots in ancient theory and its reliance on subjective patient reports, doesn't meet these new standards. There are no controlled studies demonstrating the effectiveness of genital stimulation for treating hysteria. There are no double-blind trials comparing mechanical vibrators to other treatments. The entire practice depends on anecdotal evidence and theoretical speculation rather than rigorous scientific proof. Medical licensing boards begin requiring practitioners to demonstrate competency in evidence-based medicine. Physicians who can't justify their treatments according to scientific criteria risk losing their licenses. Sexual medicine practitioners find themselves unable to provide the kind of scientific documentation that regulatory authorities now demand. The commercialization of vibrators also contributes to medical sexual. Treatments decline, though in ways that aren't immediately obvious. As vibrators become smaller, cheaper, and more widely available, they move from medical offices into private homes. Advertisements in women's magazines promote them as personal health and beauty devices, carefully avoiding explicit sexual language but making their implications clear. This commercialization has profound effects on how sexual stimulation is understood and experienced. When vibrators are medical instruments operated by physicians, the stimulation they provide can be understood as therapeutic intervention. But when the same devices are sold to consumers for private use, the medical framework becomes harder to maintain. If women can achieve the same results at home with a consumer product, why do they need expensive medical treatment? The transition from medical tool to consumer product also removes the professional authority that had legitimized sexual treatment. Physicians could justify intimate intervention as necessary medical care, requiring special training and clinical oversight. But if anyone can purchase a vibrator and use it effectively without medical supervision, the claim to special expertise becomes difficult to sustain. By the 1920s, vibrators are being advertised in popular magazines alongside other consumer health products. The advertisements promote vibrant health, personal magnetism, and therapeutic massage without explicitly mentioning sexual satisfaction, but the implications are clear to anyone familiar with the device's medical history. Women who had previously needed to visit physicians for therapeutic treatment can now achieve the same results privately, conveniently, and at a fraction of the cost. The final blow to traditional sexual medicine comes from changing social attitudes toward sexuality itself. The early 20th century sees the beginning of more open discussion of sexual pleasure and female sexuality. The work of sexologists like Havelock Ellis and later Alfred Kinsey begins to normalize conversations about sexual desire and sexual satisfaction that had previously been confined to medical contexts. As society becomes more comfortable with the idea that women might have natural sexual desires and needs, the medical framework that had made sexual treatment socially acceptable becomes less necessary. If female sexual pleasure is normal and healthy rather than pathological, there's no need for medical intervention to provide it. Women can pursue sexual satisfaction as a normal part of human experience rather than as treatment for medical dysfunction. The flapper era of the 1920s represents a dramatic shift in attitudes toward female sexuality. Young women are expected to be sexually knowledgeable, socially assertive, and personally autonomous. They reject the Victorian ideal of passive femininity that had been central to hysteria diagnosis. In this new social context, the medical model of female sexual dysfunction seems not just outdated but actively oppressive. The economic boom of the 1920s also creates new opportunities for women's social and economic participation. Women working in offices, shops, and factories report fewer of the mysterious ailments that had characterized hysteria diagnosis. The correlation between women's social freedom and the decline of hysterical symptoms further undermines the medical explanation for these conditions. Medical authorities gradually abandon sexual treatment not because it doesn't work. Many patients had reported genuine improvement, but because it no longer fits with evolving understanding of sexuality, psychology, and medical ethics. The theoretical foundations have been undermined by advances in neurology and psychology. The social justifications have been challenged by changing gender roles and women's rights. The professional standards have been raised beyond what sexual medicine can meet. The formal end comes in 1952 when the American Psychiatric Association publishes the first diagnostic and statistical manual of mental disorders. Hysteria, the condition that had justified sexual treatment for thousands of years, is removed from the official list of recognized psychiatric disorders. The diagnosis that had sent millions of women to physicians for genital stimulation simply ceases to exist as far as medical authorities are concerned. However, the disappearance of formal sexual medicine doesn't mean the disappearance of medical interest in sexuality. Instead, the field transforms into sex therapy, sexual medicine, and related specialties that approach sexual problems from psychological, physiological, and social perspectives rather than the mechanistic approaches of the past. The new disciplines acknowledge the complexity of human sexuality while maintaining appropriate professional boundaries and ethical standards. The legacy of historical sexual medicine extends far beyond specific treatments and theories that have been abandoned. The centuries-long tradition of medicalizing sexuality established patterns and assumptions about medical authority, sexual dysfunction, and the relationship between physical and psychological health that continue to influence medicine and society today. The most obvious legacy is the continued medical approach to sexual problems. While modern sex therapy operates from very different theoretical foundations than historical sexual medicine, it maintains the basic assumption that sexual problems are appropriate subjects for medical intervention. The specific treatments have changed dramatically, but the medicalization of sexuality that began in ancient times continues in modified form. Modern sexual medicine also inherited many gender assumptions that characterized historical sexual medicine. Although contemporary practitioners recognize that both men and women can experience sexual dysfunction, there remains a tendency to view female sexuality as more complex, mysterious, and likely to be influenced by psychological and social factors. These assumptions can be traced directly back to ancient theories about wandering wombs and female sexual passivity. The medical model of sexual dysfunction that dominates contemporary practice also reflects historical patterns. Current diagnostic categories like hypoactive sexual desire disorder, female orgasmic disorder, and sexual pain disorders echo the Victorian conviction that there are normal and abnormal patterns of sexual response that can be medically identified and treated. While specific criteria have changed, the basic approach of diagnosing and treating sexual variations as medical conditions continues. The pharmaceutical industry's approach to sexual enhancement also has roots in historical sexual medicine. The development of drugs like Viagra represents a return to ancient and medieval focus on chemical and mechanical solutions to sexual problems. While modern sexual pharmacology is based on genuine understanding of physiology rather than humoral theory or sympathetic magic, the basic strategy of using external interventions to modify sexual response remains the same. Perhaps more troubling is the continued tendency to use medical authority to regulate and control sexuality. While the days of prescribed orgasms are long past, medical professionals still wield considerable influence over what is considered normal or abnormal sexual behavior. The pathologization of various sexual practices and preferences often reflects social and moral judgments dressed up in medical language, much as the diagnosis of hysteria once reflected attitudes toward women's social roles. The historical pattern of viewing sexual problems as symptoms of broader health issues also persists in modified form. Contemporary medicine recognizes connections between sexual dysfunction and cardiovascular disease, diabetes, depression, and other conditions. While these connections are based on genuine physiological understanding rather than humoral theory, they reflect the same holistic approach that characterized ancient sexual medicine. The legacy extends beyond medicine into broader cultural attitudes towards sexuality. The centuries of medical control over sexuality helped establish the idea that sexual pleasure, particularly female sexual pleasure, requires expert knowledge and intervention rather than being a natural human capacity. This medicalization of sexuality continues to influence how people understand their own sexual experiences and seek help for sexual problems. The historical emphasis on sexual satisfaction as a component of health also had lasting effects. While the specific mechanisms were misunderstood, ancient and medieval physicians were correct in recognizing connections between sexual fulfillment and overall well-being. Modern research has confirmed many of these connections, though through psychological and physiological pathways rather than wandering wombs or humoral imbalances. The most significant lesson from the history of sexual medicine may be about the relationship between medical knowledge and social power. The authority to diagnose and treat sexual problems has always been closely connected to broader social authority over sexuality and gender roles. Changes in sexual medicine have typically reflected changes in social attitudes and power structures rather than purely scientific advances. This pattern suggests that contemporary approaches to sexual medicine should be evaluated not just for their scientific validity, but for their social and political implications. Medical frameworks for understanding sexuality are never value neutral. They always reflect particular assumptions about gender, pleasure, normality, and the proper role of experts in intimate matters. The history of sexual medicine also demonstrates the remarkable persistence of certain ideas across time and cultural change. The belief that sexual problems reflect broader health issues that sexual satisfaction is important for overall well-being, and that expert intervention can improve sexual function, have survived multiple revolutions in medical theory and practice. This persistence suggests that these ideas address something fundamental about human experience, even when their specific applications prove problematic. Understanding this history is crucial for anyone interested in contemporary debates about sexuality, medicine, and social control. The issues that drove ancient physicians to prescribe sexual treatment continue to shape modern discussions about sexual rights, medical authority, and the relationship between individual pleasure and social order. The medicalization of sexuality wasn't an accident or historical curiosity. It was a systematic response to genuine human needs and concerns about health, pleasure, and social stability. While the specific approaches were often misguided or harmful, the underlying recognition that sexuality and health are connected remains valid and important. As we continue to develop new approaches to sexual health and sexual medicine, the history of prescribed sex offers both cautionary tales and valuable insights. It reminds us that medical authority is always socially constructed, that sexual norms are always subject to challenge and change, and that the most intimate aspects of human experience cannot be separated from broader questions of power, knowledge, and social organization. The story of sex as medicine ultimately reveals the complex relationships between bodies and societies, between individual desires and collective norms, between scientific knowledge and social control. These relationships continue to evolve, but the patterns established over thousands of years of medical practice continue to influence how we understand sexuality, health, and the proper role of experts in the most private aspects of human life. Today, when someone visits a doctor complaining of sexual dysfunction, they're participating in a tradition that stretches back to ancient Egypt. The specific explanations have changed, the treatments have evolved, and the social context has been transformed, but the basic pattern remains. Intimate problems become medical issues. Expert intervention is sought and provided, and sexuality becomes subject to professional authority and institutional control. The vibrator that began as a medical instrument to save physicians' tired hands now sits discreetly in bedside drawers around the world, no longer prescribed by doctors but purchased by individuals seeking personal pleasure. The transformation from medical tool to consumer product represents the broader shift from prescribed sexuality to privatized pleasure, from professional control to personal choice, from medicalized treatment to commercialized satisfaction. Yet, even this transformation carries echoes of the long history of sexual medicine. The marketing of sexual enhancement products still draws on medical authority and scientific language. The promise that technology can improve sexual experience reflects the same mechanistic thinking that led Victorian physicians to prefer vibrators over manual stimulation. The belief that sexual satisfaction requires specialized knowledge and proper technique continues the ancient tradition of expert intervention in intimate matters. The woman lying on that Victorian examination table, experiencing what Dr. Pemberton called hysterical paroxysm, was both the end product of 3,000 years of sexual medicine and the beginning of its transformation into something entirely different. Her orgasm was simultaneously the last gasp of ancient medical tradition and the first breath of modern sexual liberation. The story of sex as medicine is ultimately a story about human attempts to understand and control the most fundamental aspects of existence: desire, pleasure, health, and the mysterious connections between body and mind. These attempts have taken many forms over the millennia, from Egyptian aromatic treatments to Victorian mechanical stimulation to contemporary pharmaceutical intervention. The specific methods change, but the underlying human needs and questions remain constant. As we continue to grapple with questions about sexuality, health, and the proper role of medical authority in intimate matters, the history of prescribed sex provides both warning and wisdom. It warns us about the dangers of medicalizing normal human variation and using scientific authority to enforce social control. But it also reminds us that sexuality and health are genuinely connected, that expert knowledge can sometimes help where personal experience falls short, and that the most private aspects of human life cannot be completely separated from broader social and cultural concerns. The prescription pad that once read, "Take 2 orgasms and call me in the morning," has been replaced by more sophisticated understanding of sexual health and more nuanced approaches to treatment. But the fundamental questions that led ancient physicians to prescribe sexual medicine remain with us. How do we balance individual pleasure with social order? What role should experts play in intimate matters? How do we distinguish between helpful intervention and harmful control? These questions don't have easy answers, but understanding the long history of sexual medicine can help us approach them with greater wisdom and humility. The story of sex as medicine is ultimately our story, a mirror reflecting human attempts to understand ourselves and each other across thousands of years of changing knowledge, shifting power, and persistent hope that somewhere, somehow, healing might be found.